Chairman Mao, Jamie Howe, Ho Chi Minh, Asif Din, Václav Havel, Graham Saville, No Surrender, Percy Fender, Guerrilla Cricket.
Welcome to this Guerrilla Cricket podcast. Now, in March 1706, a man called William Goldwin published a slender volume of his early verse called Musea Juveniles. Inside was a poem that would lend him a very strange kind of immortality, 95 lines in Latin, which were titled In Certamen Pilae, on match at ball. Why should we care? Well, as far as anyone knows, it is the very first piece of cricket literature. Cricket has a genuine appeal around the world, and today is certainly the topic of conversation for my two guests who are joining me from Singapore and Sydney. Most importantly, they are both best-selling writers about the game that we love. And I'm very happy to say that I've been lucky enough to record extensive interviews with both about their work. So today, we will, of course, discuss their latest books, but we're primarily going to dive into the pain, rewards, and sheer hard graft of the writer's craft. Firstly, Anindya Dutta is a banker and now writer and guerrilla cricket commentator who, for a while, has been keeping the likes of Sourav Ganguly and MS Dhoni off Amazon India's top spot with his latest book, The Greatest Year, the story of India's 1971 tours to England and the West Indies. Anindya, hello, and a very warm welcome.
Hello, Tony. Thank you very much for having me here. Delighted, as always, to be with you.
Delighted to have you. And with him, from Sydney, Ashley Gray. Ashley's a sports writer whose stories have appeared in Wisden, Fox Daily, The Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, and All Out Cricket. Most recently, he's written The Unforgiven, Mercenaries or Missionaries, the untold story of West Indian cricketers who toured apartheid South Africa, which has been nominated for a Wisden Book of the Year prize. So, Ashley, a huge welcome to you as well.
Oh, lovely to be here, Tony, yet again, and looking forward to our chat.
Well, let's then. Shall we start with you, Ashley? Because what we're really going to focus on today is the art of creating stories and writing, and particularly about cricket. Ernest Hemingway once said, "There's no rule to how to write. Sometimes it comes easily and perfectly. Sometimes it's like drilling rock and then blasting it away with charges." But let's start, if we may, with you, Ashley, and just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be a writer about cricket.
Yeah. Well, I was always a cricket fan as a kid. Perhaps what you would now call a cricket tragic. I combed the statistic books and for the right stats of the players that I loved. I used to play as well. I read all the biographies. I used to get Cricketer and Wisden when they'd come out to Australia, 3 months late by a ship. And obviously I'd watch it all on TV as well, so, I mean, I don't think I was particularly different to a lot of other boys growing up in Australia, late 70s, early 80s, that kind of period. And, it left an indelible mark on me. Those guys that I admired then, like the Lillys and Thompsons and Chappells and Marshes, I still love them now, I mean, they were heroes to me, and they still stand out as different to the men of today in some way or other. They just seem realer. Maybe it was just because I was just a little boy, but even now that they seem like, that they're from a different age, a different epoch. So, it's kind of in my blood. My cricket career was, I was coordinated. I could hit the ball, and occasionally I could do something with the ball, bowling. But the way cricket was organised back then, especially in Australia, was that often it was up to dads to coach sides. And Dad's always had favourites, and if you weren't in with the in crowd, you didn't always get a bat. So sometimes you'd be fielding for like 3 weekends in a row. But I suppose it was character building, standing at swapping from third man to fine leg for an hour, in the very hot, blazing Australian sun. But ultimately in the end, I probably wasn't good enough. But I loved it, and he loved playing, and I still play with my son out in the backyard, and I love taking him to games and scoring, and it's just I think the thing about cricket, as opposed to say football or soccer or rugby league, which is also popular here, it's more of a game of the mind, and that appealed to me. It's a dreamer's game to some degree. When you are at fine leg, there's a lot of time thinking. And,
there is. It's a very psychological game. So, but you too often got the Adil Rashid Award under Joe Root for turning up and neither batting nor bowling, by the sounds of it. Let's move on to Anindya. Now, obviously, we kind of know each other a bit now because you've been the seer of some of our cricket commentaries. But pretend we don't know each other, Anindya. Again, it's the same story for you. I remember asking you this before, but from the world of international finance to the world's best spin bowlers. Was that a huge journey or a smaller journey than you might think?
But I think it was an unimagined journey, more precisely. I didn't set out to be a banker. I became one. And somehow you can say I didn't set out to be a writer and became one. So it's just at different parts of my life. I was a banker until fairly recently for 26 years. For much of which I didn't write at all, unless I was writing things for my clients or for my bank. And a feedback that I always got was that it was interesting reading even when I was writing on very dry finance, and I was a trader for most of my life, so I was writing on trading. But I never thought much of it. And then a few years ago, I wrote an article for one of the Australian websites, and it came out, and there was immediately I got a lot of feedback saying that they really liked it, etc. Then I got a call from Kersi Meher Homji, another Sydney-based writer. And he said he loved the writing when I'd written a couple of articles. And he actually picked up one of them and said that there's a book in it. Mm-hmm. And I'd never contemplated writing a book. Mm-hmm. So, it was a 1,500-word article. And I was like, Kersi, you've got to be joking. I can't turn a 1,500-word article into a book. And he said, no. It's there. I've written 14 books, so his 15th was yet to be published, and I can tell you that there's a book in it. I said, okay. So I did something as basic as call him back again and ask him how he structures a book, because I didn't have the remotest idea how to do it. And he told me how he does it, and of course he put the caveat there that you've got to find your own way. And so I've found my own way since then. And then I started writing. This was about 7 years ago, something like that. And then I found it to be an all-encompassing passion, if you like. So I was working full time. I was writing in the morning. I was writing late at night whenever I got a chance. And the nature of what part of cricket interested me made it more difficult because I've always been interested in the history of the game, which obviously involved a lot of research. And the one thing that I've been always very careful of, even when I wrote for financial matters, was that I shouldn't get a single fact wrong, and which makes life very difficult when you're that nitpicky about something. But then you have to be when you do research.
Especially with cricket.
Exactly. And you're going to be found out very quickly if you don't, right?
Well, it's a rich seam.
Exactly.
Which is good for all. It's interesting that, from three of us, I think, two of us, probably me and you and Indo, have taken the path via other industries and things and sort of worked our way into a hobby becoming kind of a work.
Yeah.
Ashley, perhaps a little bit different for you in that you are by trade a journalist and a writer.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah, and a sub-editor as well.
I always think that must be a thankless task.
Yeah, the thing about being a sub-editor is that people would say to me with this book, they'd say, look, just pump it out, just write it and get it done, then go back and correct it and, hone those sentences, make it sing. But the trouble is when you're a sub-editor, you're used to polishing as you go, So I couldn't do that because I would feel uncomfortable knowing that something I just left wasn't perfect, in my eyes, So I couldn't go on that way and I had to do it this way. And people would say to me, you're crazy, but that's just the way I did it. And in the end, I got there. But, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But that's one of the sort of drawbacks of the trade, I suppose, is that you learn how to do things in a certain way. And, that kind of works for me. But, I've always, like I said, I've been doing it for 20 odd years now. So I've always been sub-editing and writing and not always on sport, not always on cricket either. But I think having to write in different tones for different publications and on different subjects sort of rounds you out as a writer as well, because you can draw on a lot more different expressions and ways of putting together stories as well, because one magazine might have a certain style that you have to adhere to, or it might have a certain way of structuring things. But the newspaper will have a different style and structure again, depending on which one it is. So I suppose that's been the benefit of my
that's an interesting. You've touched on an interesting point there. So the idea of style. When you're sub-editing or writing for someone else, if it's advertising copy or if it's even autobiography writing or any of those things, you have to sort of adopt a different persona, that of your audience or the editorial style of the publication you're in. But when you start to write your own books, it's you, even if the subject matter is very relevant to a particular group or a particular audience. It's your way of putting it across. So I think one thing I'd like to ask you both is your books are or the books certainly the ones I've been reading have similarities and differences. One is very much about a history of a certain type of art or craft or of a team. So Anindya, perhaps you're more the historian, but you're a storyteller in the way you bring that game history across. Ashley, you're also a historian in that you've picked a very specific, the current book, The Unforgiven, is sort of politically charged. It's sociologically charged with so many different sort of depths about those West Indian cricketers. But again, you're essentially telling a history story through multiple personalities. So in some ways, the books have similarities there. Sure. So anyway, that's kind of a long-winded way of asking the question, which is, how do you evolve, Ashley, your own style and way of your own storytelling so that you feel this is me, even though you're telling the story of something else?
Sure. I think at some point you have to back yourself and back your experience and back your way of looking at the world. Otherwise, there's no point in writing a book or a long form article. I mean, you have to trust that what you're writing about and your perspective is unique in some way and is valuable. I mean, there are many times when you're writing something and you feel that isn't the case. And that can kind of freak you out as well. I mean, there was a time here when I was doing Lawrence Rowe's chapter and I could not get past the first paragraph, and I was sitting right here, right where I am now. And it was a lovely summer's day. I was looking outside and wishing I was outside. And I just couldn't get... And I found that there were 3 or 4 different options for the next paragraph where I could go with the story, his chapter. And they all seemed quite appealing. But when I'd start them, they wouldn't work, you know, and it was just this utter sense of frustration. And I just let out this primal roar. It was like, "Ugh!" And it didn't work, by the way. But I had to go on, and, you know, and even, you know, I've got a book here from Neville Cardus, his autobiography.
Yeah.
And it's got some great stuff in here, because obviously he wrote for the Manchester Guardian, but there's an interesting bit here which I really related to when he said, the Manchester Guardian was a great but dangerous school for young journalists. It made us so word and phrase conscious that sometimes we suffered the embarrassment of the centipede, which one day became aware of the complexity and delicacy of its muscular organisation and reduced itself more or less to permanent immobility by wondering which foot to put forward next. Well, that's where I was at with the Lawrence Road chapter. And, to move on to the next part of the narrative, you know, I had to take a chance and believe in myself and get on with it. You know, at some point you have to bite the bullet, and that's ultimately what I did. So, yeah, that's kind of how I approach things, Tony. But usually with a lot more, with a little more success than I had with Roe in that beginning.
What finally unblocked the start to the Lawrence Road chapter then? What was the critical moment that you went from blank page to you felt you were onto something? Stephen King said the scariest moment is always just before you start. After that, things can only get better. And he wrote a few books.
Yeah, he did. Yes. I think I went out and had a walk and experienced some of that sunshine, came back and just looked at the first thing I had written, which is often the best thing in a way, because you come to you're closer to being pure about the subject when you approach it. And I went with that, and it just started to roll. I knew a lot about him, obviously, anyway, because I'd researched him so much. I'd interviewed him, I'd seen him, I knew the man, you know. And the thing about my book was, even though it's well structured in that there are 20 chapters on the different guys that went on the Rebel tours, each chapter itself, I didn't have a particular structure for it. You know, it would just sort of happen, and I would just sort of work it as I was going. You know, once again, the sort of the polish as you go thing. You know, I couldn't move on if the stats weren't right and the words weren't right. You know, like you were saying before. You know, if the stats aren't right, you know, you can't go.
Well, the rigor certainly comes out, and actually, you've said something there I will come back to.
Yeah.
Because it's the 20 different people. I have a slight feeling that each chapter gets to the heart of those personalities, so is slightly different in its feel, because I think you almost inhabit the trials, tribulations of each of those people. But I'm going to hold that thought, because I was going to ask Anindya the same question. You know, for you, as I say, a kind of a historian. I don't know if you'd like to be called a historian, but you're a storytelling historian in cricket. Yeah. But tell me about the inspiration for you, because it's not just the Wizards and the Story of Indian Spin. You've written about Don Bradman. You've written about the Gentleman's Game and the old style. You know, we imbue the history of cricket. You know, even when none of us were born, even me, who's older than you two, you somehow in your mind have a vision of what cricket was like that is actually probably black and white and men running around impossibly quickly. And yet you feel like you were there because you've read so much. So tell me a little bit about your inspiration to get pen to paper for your first book, perhaps, Anindya.
Yeah, it's interesting, Tony. You say that what you just said, because the first book, although it's not the first book I published, the first book I actually started working on was Spellbinding Spells. That's the one which Kersey asked me to encourage me to write. It just took a while to write, so by that time I had The Gentleman's Game, which was almost like an experiment, because The Gentleman's Game was more a collection of articles that I had written earlier, and I sort of polished them and I put it out there to see what the response to my writing would be. while I was still writing Spellbinding Spells. I wanted some feedback, if you like. So it's interesting that a lot of people, even today, are writing back to me and telling me that they love A Gentleman's Game, which is nice to know. But that's the reason why I wrote it. And then when I started writing Spellbinding Spells, it was quite interesting because for some reason, I decided to be very bold. And I said, I'm going to write this in a manner which I have not used earlier. And in line with what you were talking about, that where if I can call myself a quasi-historian, just because I guess I read so much of it and enjoy it, I actually thought that a unique approach would be if I were to write a book where I'm visualizing what's going on in front of me, and I'm writing the entire story in the present continuous. So, which was an absolute experiment because it's a 300 and whatever 50-page book, and it had to be right because the facts in there were very important. It was the first book ever written on single bowling spells, so no one had really dissected a single bowling spell and ranked them. So I have, I think, 6 chapters with 7 of the top bowling spells, which first I had to make sure, cross-referencing, that I didn't make a mistake. And thankfully, in the last 4 years, no one's come back to me to say I've made a mistake. But maybe someone will someday.
Well, you're the reference.
Yeah,
if you say it's true, it's true.
Well, they'd have to go back to a lot of archives to prove me wrong on that one, because for the 19th century spells that I wrote about, a lot of them, I have to say, are quasi-conjecture, because you only have the scoreboards. There's nothing else. And you look at those scoreboards, and then you try and cross-reference a bit of writing from somewhere about the match, and you try to make up your mind as to whether it was logically a single spell or not. And then I thought that if modern readers read it, they can't relate to the same way to an 1890 test match as I would. So why don't I narrate it like someone would watch a match on television? As if it's happening in front of them. So my entire book is written in the present continuous. And I can tell you I was one tired man by the time I finished.
Well, that's definitely something we're going to come on. Now, you both said something here which I think is really interesting. It's almost as though you're cricket statisticians and historians first, and then the writing wraps around that. And is that perhaps something that's sort of almost unique to the sport that we have in common, because it is so incredibly rich in data to start with?
I think if I may just take that one for first. I think it is unique, but then it's a huge challenge as well, because if you only depend on the statistics, you're going to get a critic or multiple critics coming and telling you that you're just regurgitating statistics, right? And that's not the point. The point is to tell the story that the statistics suggest. And I think therein lies the art, right?
But isn't that what Neville Cardus was famously so good at doing? He didn't rely upon just the stats and the chronology of the game that he was talking about. Quite often he wasn't even there. The line I've always loved, it gets trotted out on, probably shows like this, I don't know. Trent Bridge, a lotus land for batsmen, a place where it was always afternoon and 360 for 2. I mean, again, we'll come back to it, but I'm not sure you get that sort of language. Ashley, what about for you? Historian, statistician, wrapped in prose.
Yeah. I think that I've always had a head for stats because cricket is unmerciful in that way, and that everyone that plays in a game is ranked. Where you come in, when you bowl, the score you get, everything that you do is accounted for. So it's a good basis from which to start when you want to historically analyse something. But as Anindya was saying before, it's just the bones. You've got to put the flesh on it, and that's the real art. But it's just so important in cricket as well to get those stats right, because they can be interpreted in so many ways, and if you haven't got the right one to work with in the beginning, you're not only doing the record books a disservice, you're deceiving your readers. So you have to get those right. But I would consider myself a writer before I would consider myself a.
Well, yeah, it's interesting you say that, because if when you think about the Unforgiven, interestingly enough, there are stats in there. Of course, there are. And
that's why I put the scorecards at the end.
You did.
Because it's important to me. Because if I read a book and I've got all this stuff, I want to be able to refer exactly to what happened.
Any cricket fan would be lying if they weren't worrying. Well, but what was the scorecard that day? Who got how many wickets? I mean, they still will do that. But, and again, I think this is a commonality probably between both of you and books of yours that I've been lucky enough to read, is there's a huge amount of personality and emotion, quite raw emotion in perhaps more in your case, Ashley, around the personalities, the issues that they were going through, the challenges, the moral challenges that they were facing. So stats alone are never going to tell that story. What was the point at which you said there is a really deep seam to mine here that goes far beyond just cricket and led you to that book?
Well, it probably was just meeting Richard Austin in the first place and finding him in the gutter. I didn't see him on the cricket field racking up a century or taking 5 wickets or making a spectacular catch. I saw him in the gutter drinking rum from a plastic Coke bottle and pleading to me for money to feed his cocaine habits. So the story could never be about the statistics, or I was talking to a guy today from my hometown. I think I told you before, Tony, that's doing a story from Newcastle, and I actually played cricket with him as a kid, and he was saying that the book is more about the decisions that people make in their lives and the ramifications and how they reconcile them later in life, if they ever do. That always had to be the focus for me. I had to get the other stuff right, because to not do that would be to
it's the price of the ticket.
Fall out with so many cricket fans, and also myself, because I got to get these things right. Because if you want to get your argument right, the stats have to be right. So but the story is about people's lives and how people make calls on their lives that sometimes are wrong and sometimes can lead down very dark alleys. So that's more what it's about, and also the political ramifications. There are so many variables, other themes that sort of interweave there, and it got so complex at one stage that I just thought I couldn't do it. I just thought there's just so much going on in this book. It was doing my head in. But I just quickly give you a little anecdote. It was Christmas night, 2018, just before Christmas, and I was having lunch with a mate up in the suburb here called Marrickville, which is in Sydney's inner west. And we were having some Vietnamese, and I was telling him about my problems about the book, and I was halfway through it, and I didn't think I was going to make it to the end. And we were outside, and I looked up at a building across the road, and there was a mural there, and it was a mural of a picture of Nelson Mandela, and it had a big painted picture of him, and also had a quote down the bottom, and the quote said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And it just felt like he was speaking to me, because he was South African. The book was about South Africa. It just felt like a very profound moment for me, and I just thought, well, okay, I just got to do it. It's all you can do in those situations. Anyway, yeah.
So ultimately, Nelson Mandela helped you to get to that. That's quite a story. Anindya, what about you? I mean, your book again is certainly all of them really, but certainly Wizards it is about a range of different personalities and personal stories that are wrapped in the statistics of that show achievement ultimately. Who stood out for you, perhaps not just for achievement, but as a personality, where you felt that the backstory around the individual was as big or perhaps even bigger than the sporting achievements themselves? Was there anyone in there you'd pull out?
Yeah, there'd be a couple of them. The first one is the person I start the book with, and who just historically happened to be chronologically the first Indian spinner as well, Palvankar Balu, and it's an incredibly interesting story from a sociological point of view, from a political point of view as well. Besides the cricket, so he was not only India's first spin bowler, he was also from the untouchable caste of Indian society, and at a time when Mahatma Gandhi had not even started his campaign against untouchability, here was Balu, the best spinner in the country by far, known in places as far off as Surrey, where nobody had ever seen him bowl. But
as far off as Surrey?
Yes, and they wanted him. They wanted him.
The wild back of beyond.
Exactly. From where he was in Pune. Yeah.
Oh right. Well, yeah.
Yeah. So it was interesting, and then so how he came through that whole sociological barrier, if you like, and then became the famous man that he was. And I think that's an incredible story. And then he became a politician. He was a failed politician, but that's in the end he sort of he went out of politics. But then he became unofficially the first untouchable to ever captain a team of Hindus, which was just an incredible achievement. So I just found that fascinating, and also his craft, of course. And then there was the story of Subhash Gupte, who's rated probably the best spinner in the world at his peak, when the administrators basically threw his career away, and he left the game disgusted, went off to the West Indies, never came back. It's just these kinds of stories made the whole book for me really fulfilling. And just on a question that you were asking earlier, I was just thinking about that in terms of when you were asking how you write it, and Ashley was talking about his struggles with the Lawrence Rose chapter. So I write in a particularly disjointed manner, if you like. I don't know anyone else who writes like that, where if I have a book of 20 odd chapters, at any point in time, I'm writing 10 of them. It's just... well, I that's the way I work, because I'm maybe from my banking background, I'm just used to multitasking in different ways, and I get bored very easily. So if I'm working on 10 completely different things, if I get stuck on one, like you said, you got stuck on the first paragraph, I just leave it aside for the next 3 weeks, and I work on something completely different.
That's how my father used to attack the crosswords. Particularly with the paper he used to read, he'd say, don't get stuck on one clue. If you can't do it, move on and come back to it. And you'll probably find, you're trying to solve one clue somewhere else. The one you were originally stuck on, the answer will come into your head.
Yes.
Yep.
Sounds sounds quite similar. What about you, Ashley?
That sounds quite reasonable, Anindya. And makes me sound quite unreasonable, really.
But are you more linear in the way you tackle your
I couldn't write a couple of chapters at the same time. You know, I had to get really involved. I had to get a feel for the people I was writing about. Often the closest I came to what Anindya was saying is, you know, sometimes I'd have to make calls or field calls from guys who were important in other chapters. You know, I just have to record that and slot that away, you know, but I would just focus on one chapter and totally immerse myself in it, because I'd be doing a lot of archive reading as well about the guys. I'd be going through the interviews that I'd done, looking at the photos I'd taken of them, the videos, really immersing myself in who they were and what their personal culture is, you know. So, that's just how I work, and it works for me in this instance, you know. But I admire Anindya's way of going about it, and I wish I could do it like that, you know.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, you have a market, people who will read books. You have publishers who are the conduit through which your wisdom and storytelling gets to that market. Do you ever get any publisher pressure? The dreaded deadline curse, was that ever an issue for either of you? Ashley, what about you first?
Yeah, it was. I mean, the thing is, my publisher pitch, you know, they're really lovely people, and you know, I respect their publishing nous and their ways of going about things. But yeah, there was a time when I requested like a 6-month extension, which was because there were certain people who were holding out on me, you know, for the book, and, you know, weren't coming around, and, you know, and I didn't want to put out a half-baked book, you know. I didn't want to put out a book that didn't do justice to myself as a writer, but also the guys, you know, and the tours and what really went on and the fullness and wholeness of it. So, I requested an extension, and I mean, they weren't that happy about it, but they understood that, you know, it had to kind of happen. And then towards the end as well, you know, because cricket is so stats based, as we've said before, you know, you have to get these things right. And I was just so anxious and worried about it, about putting out a book that had, you know, one fact that was wrong in it, you know. So, I drove them a bit crazy at the end with my insistence on checking, you know. But as well, you know, these were living these are living people, you know, and to do justice to them, you have to get the facts right. I didn't want to have one of them say, well, no, I didn't play there in that game, or no, I actually got 54, not 53, or, you know, just those little things that can really shit you if it's written about you. But but maybe in the eyes of the publisher, they wanted the book out. You know,
I guess it's the difference between a book and a match account or a newspaper news article.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
That has a deadline. The book, by definition, mainly can have a more extended border. There's a wonderful quote. I think there was Douglas Adams, you know, wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I love deadlines. I love the whooshing noise they make as they go by. Which is kind of fun. What about you, Anindya?
Can I just add one more thing?
Oh, yes. Okay.
I did ultimately get the book done, obviously. But I also had, you know, my wife was very helpful because she's a copywriter as well. And I was running copy past her, and she doesn't know that much about cricket, but she knows where the emotional punch is in a sentence, and, you know, how to make that come out. But the thing with my wife was, well, she said, well, you spent like 18 months on it. Like, you know, how much longer are you going to spend on it? So, which was a fair enough question. I mean, I was still working, but there's a point at which you have to pull stumps on it and go with it, you know. Yeah.
And what about you? Did you find at any point people starting to yank your chain a bit and going, well, where is it?
Well, for one of the books, I did, like Ashley, have to ask for an extension, and Wizards was that book, and the reason for that was I'd been working on it for 15 months, something like that at that time, and the book had been commissioned as a 60,000 word book, more or less, and I ended up submitting 115,000. It's just because I honestly had no idea at that point in time how much more work was involved in terms of the people I was researching and writing about, because there were just so many of them who I actually didn't have an idea, from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, who were as significant as they had been at that time, until I started going back to the archives, reading about them, etc. Because you don't hear about them because they haven't gone and taken 8 wickets in an innings. Right.
Sure.
But they've done other very significant things which you need to talk about. So that took a while, and I rewrote the book 3 times. So because I was not happy with my writing, I thought I was happy every time, but I wasn't. So in the end, plus my wife didn't like it.
Well, she your biggest. Well, you've got something else you got in common. You've got supporters and critics wrapped up in.
Because she likes cricket, but she's not a huge cricket fan. But then she knows that as a lay reader, when she reads it, is it interesting? Is it what she wants to turn the page on? Right, and that's valuable feedback. So that's what I mean. So I had to ask for an extension. Where I got lucky was that the editor who's worked with me on my last 3 books, and the third one is not a cricket book. It's a sports book, but it's going to come out either end of the year or early next year. He himself is a huge cricket fan and a writer. So he understands the process, and he's pretty accommodative in that. And I think from his experience, what he does is he actually gives quite a long rope to writers in terms of the actual publishing time, so that when writers come back and ask for an extension, it doesn't upset their schedule.
I guess there's always that.
So that's but the new one, The Greatest Year, that was an exception because it's the 50th year of the 1971 victories, and they literally took the call that they wanted a book out there 2 months before publishing date. And they called and asked me whether I could put out a fairly short book, because that's what they were looking at.
So they actually commissioned you effectively in this case to write the book, as opposed to you saying, this is the book I want to write?
Exactly. So they asked me whether I could write that book in 45 days. Which was a huge challenge to me, because I'd never written a book that fast, right? Because I had to do the interviews, I had to go back and check everything. Fortunately, the spinners, the quartet, were involved in both of those series, and I had extensively interviewed them already for Wizards.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of the material from them with me, and they were a call away if I wanted to speak to them. And I managed to get some of the other cricketers to talk to me as well. And I managed to turn it around fairly quickly, only because it was a fairly short book.
Yeah, I remember Duncan Hamilton actually saying when he was writing The Great Romantic, he also dashed off, sorry if you're listening, Duncan, but he also dashed off a book called Kings of Summer. And I asked him, precisely a very similar situation, and he said, well, interestingly enough, yes, I did it at the same time because I was inspired by a particular match, but also it was easier because I was in the process of already working on the book about Neville Cardus, and hence Neville Cardus kind of infuses its way through Kings of Summer as well. So almost like a side project that came out of a bigger project kind of helped the deadline there. Were there any moments for either of you where you just thought, God, this is really, really harder than I wanted it to be? Ashley, I remember you emailed me one particular story of someone who'd been considerably less than complimentary to you personally and basically told you to fuck off, I think.
Yes.
Who was, I mean, that can't be easy if you're trying to write the side of someone's story that's in a way beneficial to them, and then being totally told, they don't care. That must be quite hard. Well, tell us the story about what it was first.
Yeah, I'll tell you the story. I mean, I won't name names because I don't want to put this guy aside unnecessarily. But you might have an idea of who it is. Anyway, I did over 150 interviews for the book, so interviews were essential to giving the book the emotional heft and the historical heft that you need in order to make it convincing and authentic. So there were a couple of guys in Barbados that I really wanted to speak to because Barbados was the rebel hub in a way. I mean, they 10 of the 20 guys that went on the tours were from Barbados. So it was important to me to talk to their contemporaries. And when I was in Sydney here, I got the numbers of a few of the test batsmen, the Barbados test batsmen of that time. And one of them, he was a bit offhand, and he said, look, if you're here, maybe give us a call. He wasn't particularly helpful, and it seemed like, he was very eager for the call to end, But I eventually got to Barbados. I thought, hell, I'm here. I've got to call him. I've got to make the most of this. And so I did. I called him on a Saturday. Sorry, not on a Saturday. It was just on probably about 6 o'clock in the evening, and I told him who I was, and he wasn't too impressed by that. He said, "Yeah, I remember you. Yeah." And then I said, can I just have 10 minutes of your time? I want to ask you about, one of the rebels in particular that you made your debut with. And he said to me that he didn't care how far I'd travelled around the world to see him. He didn't care that, that I had a wife and kids. He didn't care that, I'd paid out all this money to come there off my own bat. He didn't care that I was, only probably 5 or 10 minutes away from him. And he told me in no uncertain terms. And he essentially told me to go and shove it, because he wanted nothing to do with me, and he didn't want to hear any more of my story. And he then told me that, when he was a test cricketer, we didn't get paid a lot, and he sort of had this sort of rant about his own problems, I suppose. And then he essentially told me to get effed, at the end. And that was it. So I felt a little bit down about that. And that was at 6 o'clock. But later that night, I had to go and see Emerson Trotman, who was one of the rebels. And probably the least famous. I mean, Emerson Trotman is not a name that turns most cricket fans' heads because, he never played for the West Indies, and his contributions were mainly with Barbados and in South Africa and in Holland as well. But, so I went along to his bar in St. Lawrence Gap, the glitzy area of just out of Bridgetown there. And, I sort of sidled up to him, and, he wasn't happy to see me. And he sort of told me that, if I wrote anything bad about him, that he'd sue me. And, he didn't want to be a part of the book, and that although he did sign my sort of autograph book, my leather-bound autograph book that I brought along for all the rebels to sign, he signed that. So it was a pretty horrible little meeting that we had. Although he did give me a beer, he gave me a free Banks beer, which I downed rather quickly. But then I just sat there, just sort of watching him performing his bar tasks and watching karaoke singers, and sort of British tourists.
That sort of sums up a little bit some of the schizophrenic nature almost of, some of the stories that you tell in that book. You had players who were clearly good enough to go on that tour.
Yeah.
Great achievements. feelings of guilt and uncertainty about whether they should have done it. It sounds to me like that almost encapsulates a bit that sort of thin dividing line between the way they feel about having been involved in it.
Yeah, well, see, he's coaching Barbados Pride, which is like the first class side.
But you're not going to say who it is. But you're giving us enough clues.
Sorry, Emerson Trotman is. Emerson
Trotman. Sorry, right, yeah.
He's the coach of the Barbados Pride side. So, in some ways, he probably had something to lose. But he told me that he was a professional, and that if he was a professional, he deserves to be paid. So that's how that kind of panned out. So the next morning, I wake up in my little hotel room. I look out, and I see the azure blue sea. I see it's beautiful and sunshine everywhere. There are palm trees, the golden sands, and I felt like crap, because I'd been rejected twice that previous night, and it was a really, really tough moment for me. And so what I did was I elected to go on a tour of Bridgetown, the sort of historical Bridgetown. And what happened was the tour guide, a guy called Trevor Marshall, just happens to be a cricket fan and a very erudite historian, And so the tour in itself was fantastic. But afterwards, he took me to a game at Queen's Park Oval, which is probably about 10 minutes walk from the centre of Bridgetown, and the famous Spartan Cricket Club. So he took me into the pavilion, the Walcott stand. I looked at all the memorabilia, and it was just great to be out and about. And all of a sudden I was recharged and I was back into it, and I had my mojo back, and I was like, okay, I can get out there again and start calling these guys up and telling them I'm here, and the whole thing. So it was back in train. But that was probably my toughest moment, I'd say. When I was
quite lucky in a way that you had a very positive experience to follow the negative one. It's almost like it sounds like it sort of recharged you when you needed it. Yeah. The shot in the arm. What about you, Anindya? Was there any moments when you thought, "Oh God, I'm not going to do this"?
Well, I think the interviewing part is always difficult because it's unpredictable. Like Ashley was saying, it depends. You don't really know the person, right? You know the person as a cricketer. You don't know what the person is like face to face, or even on the phone. And sometimes by email or text. It can be bad on any medium. I think in the beginning it was a bit challenging mentally when people would refuse to speak or be rude, and you'd wonder why that was so, because first, I'm not sure there were 1,000 people walking around wanting to know their story anymore, to be brutally frank.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then, you're not necessarily trying to say something which is going to be construed as bad against them. Of course, they don't do that. And that sometimes worked in my favor, where because I'm not a journalist, I have no pretensions of being one. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people treat me, much more neutrally, if you like, and are happy to talk to me more than they would to a journalist, because they just have such bad experience with certain journalists.
Yeah.
Journalists often have an angle.
Yeah. So
not always favourable. If you're
I've learned to tell exactly. So I've learned to tell people that, look, I'm just a writer. I'm just telling a story. I have no intention, and you can go back and read my previous books. I have no intention of making judgments when I write something. I might have my views, but they're not judgments. And they will always be backed either by someone else's quote or by facts. If I ever say negative about something negative about someone. So that's. But then what happened after a while is I've just sort of got used to. Now nobody's literally asked me to F off, but they've said that in not so many words. But I've sort of got used to the fact that let's just move on. As long as I've got enough secondary sources for this person, and this person does not want to talk to me, I'm not going to get put off by this. I'm just going to move on and talk to someone else who is willing to talk and who's willing to give me stories. And my experience, again, is that Ashley was saying, sometimes it's so much easier to get stories from people who were not central to the theme, if you like. And they have so many more stories to tell, which have not been told before. And for me, that's really interesting because then you take that and that makes it something different from what a journalist could have written about during that time.
Sure.
It's an angle which I enjoy.
So I'm a bit conscious of time, not least because I want to be able to get this edited into something we can use next week during the Aussie games. But there is a question I wanted definitely to ask you about, or a couple more questions I wanted to ask you both. One is writers and influencers for you, people who have influenced you in what they've written and how they've written it. At least one probably in cricket. Ashley, what about you? Who books that you've read and writers that you've read and you thought, I need that there's something in that I want to be reflected in the way I think about the way I write?
Yeah, I think over time, guys like I was a big admirer of Peter Roebuck's copy. Mm-hmm. I liked the way he made cricket into something more than cricket, that it was a transformative experience for the batsman walking to the crease, almost as if the batsman is a callow youth, walks to the crease, takes guard, gets his eye in, makes a score, comes off a better human being, a better man, almost a man. You know, I love the way he sort of pitched it in those kind of terms. I also appreciate the sort of the way that Gideon Haigh, he manages to quarry areas that haven't been written about before, but in such a poetic and in such a poetic way, which I think is
Mystery
really...
Spinner, didn't he? Which I'm sure will be of interest to Anindya. I can see you smiling there. So.
Absolutely.
And but the book that really I think is the best cricket book I've ever read, and I thought that immediately after I read it, and I've since been validated because it's been voted the best ever cricket book, was Golden Boy, Christian Ryan's book
Kim Hughes, right?
On Kim Hughes. And Kim Hughes wasn't even didn't even take part in the writing of in the producing of the book. He didn't want anything to do with it. So it was all secondary accounts, but the way it's written, it's brilliant, it's sharp, it's smart, it's sort of sassy, but it also brings alive that period, the early 80s and mid 80s.
I think it was subtitled "The Bad Old Days of Australian Cricket," wasn't it?
It was indeed. But what it also did was it dissected the way Australian males relate to each other. This really tough kind of bully boy way, of the playground. When you're a kid, and I grew up with it as well. And then it's played out as adults as well. So you have this this scene where Dennis Lillee is bowling bounces to his captain Kim Hughes in the nets in order to try and injure him, because he's got apparently a grudge against Hughes, because Hughes got the WA and Australian captaincy instead of his good mate Rod Marsh. I mean, this is what I think Jeff Lawson says, but things like that. I just thought it was a brilliant analysis of the way Australian. It was, to me, that's what it was more about, because I'd seen those guys, and I even though they acted like school kids there, I still love them, despite,
But again, you've picked a book though, and I think it's really interesting that you've picked a book there that is about, flawed would be unkind, but I remember Kim Hughes' tears He felt it was all too much to him at one point. You know, the 81 Ashes series and that capitulation. It's kind of interesting to wind forward 40 years, is it? God, is it really 40 years? And you think of something like Steve Smith's Men. And at the heart of that book is a relentlessly aggressive, win at all costs, slightly unpleasant culture. Actually, in some ways, things we secretly admire Australians for, though didn't hear it from me. But it is interesting. Those books were 40 years apart. One is the story of a participant. One is written by an observer, but it gets deep to the heart of a culture. Tackles therefore a similar subject in quite different ways, I think.
I think that's a good point, Tony. I hadn't thought of it like that before, but I think you're onto something there, because it is almost a continuation of that culture. But by the same token, as you say, there's something ugly about it, but there's also something admirable about it.
It's what's fueled the Ashes for years.
That people, on the one hand, see Australians as bully boys, but on the other hand, they admire the fact that we go for it, and that we will absolutely give our all at any given point in time and do whatever it takes to get a victory. But the Golden Boy was a brilliant book, and I think Wisden or the Cricketer, someone like that, recently voted it the best cricket book ever. And I thought, that's what I thought when I read it at the time. I thought, if someone betters this, they're doing a really good job. So I was inspired by Christian Wright. I actually did write for him when he was editing Inside Cricket here. And while I was writing, I was conscious. I mean, as Anindya will tell you, I mean, every sentence is laboured over. Every sentence has to be crafted. The words have to, they have to hum. The whole sentence has to hum. So, and I was conscious of how brilliantly Christian Ryan's book hummed, and so I wanted to try and duplicate that. I could not his style, but my own style, but to make it as best as it possibly could be.
Wow! Somehow I doubt that the book Tim Paine, The Cuddly Years, is quite going to be may not make it in quite the same way, but maybe there isn't even an idea in that. And Nindo, what about you? Books that have inspired, books or writers that have really inspired you?
Well, Neville Cardus, clearly. I mean, I whatever you or people might say about him, his writing being literature rather than have anything to do with facts. The reality is, you love reading what he writes. I mean, it just makes for beautiful reading. So every time I go back and read Neville Cardus's especially the earlier books, I'm like, wish I could write like that. And but I don't necessarily write like that, because I think people today don't necessarily want to read writing like that. So I think writing's become modern writing's become a bit more simplistic, if you like, in terms of the usage of words and storytelling in a way. But
I think it suffered a little because of that.
Sorry, you mean the romance of the language?
Yeah, because one of the things I wanted to close by chatting to you both about was very much how cricket writing or sports writing has changed. And I guess you could always say, from Cardus to any of the books we've talked about here, what is the thing that has most changed in the way we read and consume?
Well, I think from my perspective, if you read, just to go back to your previous question just for a minute, so it's quite eclectic in terms of the writers that I particularly personally enjoy reading. So there's Neville Cardus, there's David Frith. I'm a huge fan of David Frith's writing, and it, as you know, it's very different, right? I mean, there's nothing Cardusian about the way David Frith writes, but I enjoy the fact that he makes storytelling of dry facts very interesting. So I like reading that. Indian writer Ramchandra Guha, A Corner of a Foreign Field, is one of the best cricket books I have ever read. If you can call it a cricket book, it's a sociological study, historic.
There it is.
There you go.
Borrowed, of course. Borrowed from Rupert Brooke, I believe.
Yeah.
Some corner of a foreign field that is forever England.
Of course. Everything's borrowed from the English.
Yeah, well, yes. I liked also the way that you have Cardusian, almost alongside Shakespearean or Chaucerian. We now have Cardusian, which is brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, and then a couple of Aussie writers. I like Ray Robinson, actually. I like Ray Robinson writing. So to then go back to the question about what's changed, I think what's changed is the language that one reads today, and is much less flowery, if you like, than 100 years ago. So I think the language that people speak. So I have an interesting story here. About 15 years ago, I think, I was visiting London. I didn't live in London at that point in time, so I was visiting London along with a few clients, and we went out for an afternoon tour of London because one of the clients wanted to go, and we had a historian as a tour guide, and we started talking about language after a while, and he'd heard us speak between ourselves. Indians speak English between. We don't understand each other any other way in many situations. So we were speaking in English, and he said, some of the words that you're using, we haven't used in England in 30 years, right? But that was, my generation. If you look at the readers today, English is taught phonetically, which I just find. My wife's a teacher, so that's the first time I saw that, and which to me is completely bizarre. But that is the way it's taught in a lot of places. So what people consume in terms of language, I think, has changed. And to keep with that, if you want your writing to be relevant to what readers can relate to, I think the language needs to be more modern. And I believe that that's one of the reasons why the language has changed. So I tell young writers whenever they send me something or they ask for opinions or whatever, and I find that what they have written is something Neville Cardus would have probably written, and because they just love that language. And my feedback to them is it's lovely, but it's not like cricket writing is today. So
you think it's poorer or better because of that, Ashley?
I think it's just different.
Yeah, I think when you read Cardus, you're appreciating it, that it might have been written in the 1930s or 40s, so there's a different feeling to it, and I think that's part of the charm of it for us reading it now, because you're being immersed in another way of looking at the world and another way of describing the world. So, yeah.
The world, it reflects the world we're in to a certain extent. If Reggie Spooner or Johnny Tardsley were playing today, there might be a little more, perhaps, investigation into what made them the way that they were, perhaps more than the description of what they were. I think of a book like, what's Marcus Trescothick's Coming Back to Me. Today we are probably more willing to explore emotion behind the personalities we watch. Probably because it's more available to find out about that, and people are more open about talking about it. So I certainly agree with Anindya that perhaps there is an economy of words and a brevity in today's writing, but I think you're able to mine potentially even slightly deeper subject matter in sports writing than you perhaps could historically. Anyway, look, gentlemen, it would be remiss of me if I wasn't to ask both of you a couple of final questions. And that would be what's in the pipeline. So, Ashley, let me come to you first. And obviously, we'll just close by talking about both recent books. But what's keeping you busy at the moment, apart from chatting to us?
Yeah, well, there is a lot. There is
a lot of work
of,
to promote a book, by the way, I would
yeah,
imagine.
Yeah, a lot of it falls back on the author, and at the moment, it's one of the few things that I've got to that's happening for me at the moment, because my work has declined during the COVID period. So in a way, it's been a blessing, because it's given me more time to promote the book. But yeah, it's hard work doing that. Look, Lawrence Rowe has asked me to write his biography, which I would like to do. I mean, I've already met him and interviewed him, but ideally I'd like to see him again, and he'd take me back to Jamaica and the places that and the people that he knew there when he was growing up. And because although I take Anindya's point that writing today isn't as flowery, and that in some ways it's perhaps sharper, which is good, because stories are probably more easily digested by readers. But I think there's still scope for amazingly different angles on things, and I'm looking for the way that we can make this book something out of the ordinary in terms of a biography. I don't just want to write Lawrence was born,
yeah.
he had a few good innings at the crease, he went on the Rebel tours, he was forced to leave to go to America, and blah, he's almost dead, I want to be able to, I think there's still scope, for the imagination to work in these things, in biographies, and to use flowery language, but in a situation where it's going to work, and I think that's the art of the writer, is to be able to make that work, at different times. I mean, it may not always be sort of the right thing to do, but I think, that the current style that Anindya was talking about is like all styles. It is a style. It's a fashion. It doesn't have to be the way that you do things. There are, and the great writers will come through and redefine that style and give you something else, and some other way of looking at words and at stories and at narratives and how they relate to the reader. So, yeah. Anyway, that's where I'm at in terms of the old pipeline.
Well, that's going to be an associated project, I guess, to the last one, but a very interesting one.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, John Steinbeck. What did John Steinbeck say? He said, "A great and interesting story is about everyone, or it will not last." And he knew a thing about storytelling. So you're on the same page there. So the Lawrence Rowe, the true story, the deeper story, the depth behind the man, I think is definitely going to be one to look out for. And Anindya, what about you? What's in your? I mean, you're still talking about the greatest year. It's still up there, top of the Amazon Indian charts, isn't it?
Well, much more than I thought it would be. So it's been out there for a month at number one. Obviously, people are enjoying reading it. Thank you. Thank you so much. So people are enjoying reading it. It's a short read, and it's a new generation of readers who've heard about those victories which started it all, if you like, for Indian cricket, have a chance to read those stories. So I guess that's why it's doing well. But I really enjoyed writing it. I've got a book in publication, like I was mentioning, which should come out by the end of the year, maybe early next year. That's not on cricket. That's also on sports history, Indian sports history. So I can't talk about it at the moment, but we're just starting to go through the editing process of it now. And I just got a call from my editor today, actually, to say that let's speed it up. We decided to leave it until early next year because of COVID. And then today he called and said, let's speed it up, and we'll try and get it out by the end of the year. And I'm I've been working on a work of fiction I started a long time ago, and that's going to go on for a while. So there'll be a cricket angle to it. That's all I know.
What? Oh, let us know if you need any help, any inspiration. Ashley and I will be on the end of a phone probably.
You did say, Tony, I was going to say in the notes when you sent us the email, you did say what our highs were during.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to end on a gloomy note. So give us a couple of highs then.
Okay. Well, I think the best highs are when you don't expect them, you know, and for me, one of the highs, it's a funny little story. Well, it's a little story. When I was going to see Herbert Chang in Greenwich Town, in West Kingston there, sort of ghetto area, and my taxi driver, he took me down, I think it's Maxfield Avenue, past Studio One, and we knew that Herbert, I knew from my research and talking to one of his neighbours that he loved Pepsi Cola. And I realised that we were only a few hundred yards from his place and we didn't have any Pepsi Cola. So I noticed a little shack at the side of the road, and I said to the taxi driver, let's stop here and get some Pepsi for Herbert, you know, because he'll appreciate it. And he said to me, okay, look, I'll get out and get it. I said, no, look, I've got to get out and get it. Really, I can't be insulated, you know, during this process. I have to immerse myself at some point in this world, you know. I can't live in a bubble, you know. So I got out and I walked up into the shack that, you know, was selling various drinks and other things, and it had all iron bars at the front. So I knew that obviously, you know, there'd been some criminal shenanigans there at some point in the past. And as I walked in, 5 local guys, these massive, huge guys, stinking of marijuana, walked in. And they walked really close to me. I thought, oh, shit, what's going to happen here? You know, what are these guys going to do, you know? And I was thinking I should have listened to the taxi driver. And then one of them, the sort of front man of the sort of gang, you know, looked at me and he just pointed to my shoes. And he goes, Clark's desert boots. I'm like, yeah, Clark's. He said, and he put his hand out. He said, hey, give me 5 man, you know. And from that moment on, I was like some kind of king because I wore Clark's desert boots. And I've since discovered that the rude boys of Jamaica in the 60s, they used to wear Clark's desert boots as well. And there's quite a cult of wearing Clark's desert boots in Jamaica. So my recommendation is that if you're ever in the ghetto areas of Kingston, make sure you're wearing Clark's desert boots. You know. So we had a nice little conversation. One of them was actually a dance hall dancer, you know, and he had you know, his own sort of funky clothes on and all the rest. I mean, it was an experience that could have been turned out quite badly, actually turned out quite nicely. And I got my Pepsi, went and saw Herbert, and, you know, we had a great interview, and, you know, it just gave me a nice little booster for the day, you know, to get me into things. But just things like that, where you're getting an authentic experience, you know, I think it really adds, obviously, to your experience to your ideas and perspective as a writer, you know. And also, it might have saved my life at that point in time. So, yeah.
Well, that's good life advice. Clark's desert boots, if you happen to be in the dodgier parts of town. We have been enjoying immensely the company of Ashley Gray, author of The Unforgiven, Mercenaries or Missionaries, and of course Anindya Dutta, guerrilla cricket commentator, author of Wizards, The Story of Indian Spin Bowling, and The Greatest Year, 1971 Tours of West Indies and England. This will be available as a podcast. You can get it on all the usual podcast channels, Podbean, iTunes, etc. You'll also be able to watch it as videos as well. We thank both gentlemen for your company. Ashley, thank you so much. And Anindya, thank you so much. take care. These are troubled times. We will come out of it. At least we all do have some cricket to watch and to talk about.
Thank you
we
very
will
much.
see you all soon. Thank you very much for watching and listening.
Guerrilla cricket.